The impossible state. Islam, politics, and modernity's moral predicament. Wael. Hallaq. 6. Beleaguering globalization and moral economy. Money is everywhere conceived as purpose, and countless things that are really ends in themselves are thereby degraded to mere means. George Simmel, The Philosophy of Money. He who gives of his wealth and fears God, and who believes in doing good, we will ease his way unto an easy state. But he who hoards and deems himself independent, and disbelieves in doing good, we will ease his way unto adversity. His riches will not save him when he perishes. Therefore I have warned you of the scorching fire which only the wretched must endure. He who denies and turns away, but saved from it is the righteous, who gives of his wealth so that he may grow in goodness. Quran, 92. 5-18. The pious, in whose wealth the beggar and the outcast have due share. Quran, 51. 15, 19. You shall not drive the beggar away. Quran, 93. 10. Let us suppose, for the sake of argument, that Islamic governance has become fully established. Let us suppose that the minimal conditions for such a creation have been satisfied, including, but not limited to, the following. 1. The establishment of a divine sovereignty in which God's cosmic moral laws are translated, as a system of moral principles, into practical legal norms. 2. A robust separation of powers where the legislative, the discoverer of said practical legal norms, is fully independent, genuinely representing the source of all laws of the land. 3. The legislative and the judicial powers are woven from a moral fabric whose warp and woof is a thorough amalgam of fact and value and of the is and ought. 4. An executive power is largely confined to the implementation of legislative will and permitted to issue temporary and small-scale administrative regulations consistent with this will. 5. A situation where morally based practical legal norms are put in the service of society, nurturing the community qua community and serving its interests as a morally constituted entity. This includes a healthy dose of egalitarianism and a Quranically based system of social justice. 6. Educational institutions at all levels are designed and operated by a fully independent civil society that has been formed by a dialectic of conditions 1 to 5, above. 7. The educational system, lower and higher, asks and answers questions about the meaning of the good life, engaging science and the humanities only insofar as the morally good life requires investigation. Here reason is not instrumentalized. 8. The concept of the citizen is successfully metamorphosed into the concept of the paradigmatically moral community, in which each member stands with other members in a moral relationship of mutual ties. Here, the Schmittian concept of the political is sent to oblivion and, together with it, the citizen's sacrifice. And 9. The Muslim community's individual members practice the art of caring for the self, viewing themselves, aggregately and severally, as an extension of a morally imbued universe. 1. A globalized world. Should we suppose the coming into existence of such a paradigmatic form of governance, we must also suppose and, indeed, take for granted, that this governance has to live in a community of modern states, ones constituted according to the criteria we have delineated in the previous 4 chapters. As we have seen, the very concept of popular sovereignty, by definition, both presupposes and entails the existence of other states. A state is defined only by the existence of other states, by virtue of their sanction of each member of their community as a sovereign entity. Our world is not only made up of states, but it is also a place in which there exists no apolitical space between or among these states. A person without a state is a persona non grata. Thus, for Islamic governance to constitute itself as a politically recognized entity, it must be acknowledged as a participant in the community of nation-states, no matter how its Weltanschauung may differ from these states. This is not all, however. This international order of states has been increasingly dominated by a relatively new power relationship that has come to be known as globalization. Although the world has witnessed, for over 2 millennia, conquests, migrations, and certain forms of trans-regional commercial activity, modern globalization possesses a different quality. It is not only an economic phenomenon, as the pre-modern commercial form mainly was, though on a small scale. It is virulently economic, and it is extensively and intrusively political and cultural as well. Essential to the modern form of globalization is an unprecedented dialectic, generated by powerful telecommunications technology, between the local and global, where the import of local events automatically and synchronically present globalized meanings. Which is to say, conversely, that global meanings and events intermesh in localized life, automatically rendering these global meanings, as they unfold, integral to the local. In substantive terms, political and especially economic transnational networks have asserted their dominance across state boundaries, rendering these boundaries largely permeable. Furthermore, it is abundantly clear that the markets and economies that control and direct this massive movement toward globalization are capitalist and not socialist, egalitarian, or populist. Globalization is clearly the project of the rich and powerful states and the colossal corporations ostensibly regulated by them, a project largely imposed on weaker states. And it so happens that the political economic paradigm of these powerful states is a liberal one. No other significant economic political force can be detected. With this dominance, the goal of the liberal order is the creation, to the largest extent possible, of a single or unified world market operating under shared, common, even identical legal norms. Even though the globalizing liberal order crosses, by definition, state boundaries, item bodies, and reflects nearly the same ideology of the liberal state, which has largely conduced to the virulent, most modern forms of globalization. The strong correlation and connection between the two can hardly be denied. And if this much is accepted, then the founding ideology and operative mode of globalization comport, mutatis mutandis, with the constitutive ideological features of the paradigmatic modern state. This comportment, however, does not give rise to a unified interpretation of the relationship between the state and globalization. Political and international relations theory has debated this question for almost 2 decades, dividing itself along 2 main theses. The first depicts the state, having conduced to the movement of global capital, as progressively losing its autonomy, power, and centralizing capacity. Because of the heave and thrust of globalization, the state is losing its ability to maintain itself as a unified set of institutions, with executive power and thus sovereignty being affected in the process. Facing the stress of economic globalization, the state is also said to have lost a certain measure of its power to control its internal economic, social, and cultural spheres. Yet the receding power of the state in certain economic and other domains does not mean that its disappearance is imminent. It remains, even on this thesis, a regulatory force that global institutions rely upon for further expansion of markets, both within its borders and outside them. But there is no question that the balance of power has shifted and continues to shift in favor of the global market and away from the state. The second thesis views the nation-state as capable of upholding its status and strength in the new globalized world. The state, according to this thesis, remains a key political actor that has not only resisted but dictated the forces of the international economic market. It continues to define the concept of territoriality and citizenship, a concept that remains as solid now as it has been for the past century. Above all, the state has maintained its political character despite, if not because of, the increasing range of international regulations. It not only itself plays an important role in the creation of these regulations but also confers legitimacy upon supra- and transnational corporations. The state continues to enjoy sovereignty and independent legislation and to have exclusive control over the means of legitimate violence. It also has absolute power over the bureaucratic machinery and continues to expand its cultural penetration in the social order. with its massive power structure and by the logic of the rules of stimulus and response. The state is said to have reacted advantageously to the competitive challenges of globalization, in the process strengthening itself in these and other domains. It is even said to be the major institutional framework in and through which the contemporary round of globalization is being fought out. Finally, this second thesis, in order to bolster the credibility of its arguments, takes into serious consideration the social and economic disparities that globalization has intensified, indeed created. These disparities are bound to engender, as they have, social and political unrest that only the state can address through its reforms and policies in the spheres of distribution of wealth and social justice. The state, in other words, will continue to be indispensable. For our purposes, it is possible to subsume under the second thesis the so-called transformationalist school, since this school views the state as able, in the short run, to withstand the overall effects of globalization and, in the long run, to adjust or transform itself into an order in which traditional political and social categories will be replaced by new ones. In other words, the state will be able to reconstitute itself and thereby successfully meet the challenges posed by globalization. The two theses we have outlined, and the range of views represented in them, essentially offer the position that the state will either persist or be replaced by a new globalized structure of power. The view that the state will adjust and transform itself so as to meet the globalizing challenge is, in our view, somewhat redundant because it apparently does not take for granted the essential premise that change and adjustment are integral to the state as a historical process. The state, let us take it for granted, did undergo transformations in the past and will continue to do so, and this must be the latent, though unarticulated, assumption of the second thesis. Yet the transformations cannot be so drastic as to metamorphose the state into something lacking in resemblance to anything we have known it to be for the past 2 centuries. For once this occurs, we can no longer talk of the state except to compose its requiem. In this event, we would be left with the first thesis, if any at all, since even this thesis is premised upon an assessment of the state's ability to cope. We are therefore left with 3 schematic possibilities. The total victory of globalization, the total victory of the state, or a complex and continuous dialectic of both friction and cooperation between the two. In the foreseeable future, neither victory seems likely to happen, leaving us with the third possibility, which is largely the present reality on the ground, plus any variation on the more or less existing situation. We contend that if Islamic governance, as we have seen, is incompatible with the modern state, it will be even less compatible with 1. The present, or even foreseeable, form of globalization as the sole form of governance and 2. The synthetic result of any dialectic between this form of globalization and the state. Now, globalization has come to mean several different things, none of which is insignificant or without serious implications. We briefly note 3 main characteristics, the first being the cultural. The new telecommunication technologies have taken away some of the state's monopoly in the production of culture and cultural forms, now opening the sphere to competing forces that have generally had the overall effect of globalizing certain, but not other, cultural forms. One can safely say that while particular aspects of local traditional cultures have, by virtue of globalization, been subject to protection. Think of World Heritage Sites. These remain museum-like phenomena competing with the rapid, aggressive, and massive advances of generally Western cultural types. Think of Western performing arts. The McDonald's diet, Walmart's sweatshop practices, the stiff modern business suit, the culture of consuming alcohol, and the abandonment in Afro-Asian countries of traditional cultural forms, and the vanishing means of their production, in favor of their Western counterparts. The threat of cultural displacement haunts, though to a lesser extent, even some Western regions, as evidenced in the case of Quebec and its continuous struggle against Anglo-American cultural hegemony. The Catalans and the Basques are two other examples in point. Needless to say, cultural hegemony over the non-West is concomitant with forms of dominant political and military power, which are in turn concomitant with economy and markets. Here, the state remains a significant source of globalization. As Martin Shaw has argued, the contemporary paradigmatic form of the modern state is not just that of a nation-state but also a massive, institutionally complex and messy agglomeration of state power that has undergone further transformations, and it is becoming possible to see the Western state as a global form of state power. Drawing on Michael Mann's theory. And he might have enlisted Carl Schmitt as well. Shaw argues that globalization is as much a political and military force as it is an economic one in terms of importance, and that these multi-powers represent the continuing dominance of the West over more or less the entire world. There is little doubt, however, that the economic aspect of globalization is the most pronounced. It remains the first priority of ASEAN, the European Union, NAFTA, Mercosur, APEC, CIS, and the OECD, not to mention the WTO, IMF, World Bank, and others. The sheer size of the financial global market is staggering, overshadowing the total costs of global militarism, another instrument of globalization. By the mid-1990s, world exports equaled no less than 17% of world output, representing a 10% increase over that of the 3 previous decades combined. The numbers have increased since and are increasing daily. Thus, to say that globalization privileges, as does modern society at large, material wealth and economic prosperity is to state what is most evident. In this respect, we are looking at an economic model that issues from the same logic as that of the paradigmatic state, which happens to be staunchly liberal in orientation. However, the world economy is undoubtedly more intensively pursued and minimally regulated, having little resemblance to a system. It therefore lacks any mechanism similar to what the state has developed in dealing with issues of social justice and wealth redistribution. The United States being a partial exception here, even when compared with far less prosperous countries. In this respect, the state, however impoverished its record, has been more attentive than anything globalization has so far managed or is likely to manage. Yet, where markets and capital are concerned, the state should not be always pitted against globalization, as if the latter were entirely out of its control, as some theories of globalization make it to be. Globalized free markets are largely the work of the state, led, in the current situation, primarily by the United States but also by Europe and Japan. Not to mention emerging China. One prominent example of the state's role. An example essential for our inquiry, is the stark fact that the state-created and state-regulated corporation plays a central role in the globalized economy. Apart from any judgment about the merits or demerits of globalization qua globalization, a driving force of globalization has undoubtedly been the corporation. Thus, it is reasonable to assess globalization by one of its dominant features, that is, its corporate ethic, which has received and continues to receive the endorsement of the state. Despite the fact that the early modern state recognized the moral repugnancy of the corporation, and although it had outlawed it for a period on the grounds that it subverts personal moral responsibility, the state has nonetheless allowed it not only to come back but to do so with an enhanced juristic personality, the very quality that initially outraged the government's moral sense. Space does not allow extensive comment on the nature of the corporation, but one aspect is crystal clear. The corporation is created by law for one purpose: to increase its wealth and to prioritize this purpose above all others, including social responsibility, which, when it exists at all, is placed in the service of generating even more profit. Corporate charity and social responsibility thus become strategies to increase profits and hence the economic size of the corporation. This is precisely why corporation-based globalization cannot be with the state, because the state has developed the means of addressing, however minimally, the human needs of its own citizens. The corporation has, by contrast, not only failed to do the same. It has also been notorious in its inhumane and exploitative practices, destroying the lives of people. So-called externalities. As consumers of their products. As victims of chemical and oil spillages, as abused laborers in their sweatshops, and as inhabitants of a planet being slowly but assuredly destroyed by their callous industrial practices. We may conclude that none of the features we have attributed to the nation-state in the last 4 chapters has, under globalization, diminished to an extent sufficient to justify a reconsideration of its nature. All features, or what we called form properties, have either been minimally affected. For example, sovereignty and state cultural monopoly. Or even enhanced. For example, legal regulation and bureaucracy. On the other hand, there is nothing in the form properties of globalization, except for its range, that the state does not already possess. Globalization has no real sovereignty. It has, compared to the state, and independent of it, minimalistic powers to exercise legitimate violence and the threat of its use. Its legislative competence is likewise comparatively limited. And its potency, as an autonomous agency, to permeate the cultural domain is still in its infancy. In fact, globalization possesses no cultural autonomy, because it derives its cultural thrust, as we have seen, from a Western society heavily influenced by state interference. The educational and the larger cultural spheres, significant arenas of power formation, remain penetrated by and under the direct control of the nation-state, while globalization is chiefly their semiconductor. However rapidly it is increasing its conductive capacity. Now, isolation not being an option. Certainly in the long run. Islamic governance must deal with both the nation-state and a globalized world, both of which operate according to a certain set of parameters. We have noted most of these in the foregoing chapters, having left one out, namely, liberal, free market capitalism. We shall address this characteristic in the next section and conclude. In a set of brief remarks, with a synthesis that brings in the conditions of Islamic governance we have outlined in the first paragraph of this chapter. 2. Islam's moral economy. Just as liberal economics dominating the world today are defined by a set of principles that distinguish them from other economic orientations, such as socialism, so is the Islamic system of economics, nowadays nearly all but forgotten. And just as modern liberal economics rests on a certain conception of the world and a particular form of political life, so does Islam's economy, which is heavily colored, if not fully determined, by a certain conception of the world that was not political but Shari in nature. Whereas liberal economic philosophy, both at the state and globalization levels, is characterized by free trade, free movement of capital, privatization, and the desideratum of maximizing profit and capital accumulation for their own sake. Hence the much noted irrationality of capitalism. The Islamic paradigm rests on what might be called a moral economy. The paradigm of this economy emerged with the Quran itself, the founding document of Islam, its cultures, and its material world. It was further elaborated by the articulation of prophetic narrative and subsequently by the encompassing system of the Sharia as a discursive and institutional phenomenon. While commercial practices and economic activities varied from region to region and from one century or period to the next, the Sharia moral values reigned supreme, creating an overall reality that testified to both its success and prevalence. The success can be measured by the indisputable fact that Islamic material civilization and Islamic regional and international commerce were among the most vibrant and prominent in pre-modern world history. This, perhaps understated, characterization is not only validated by what we know about Islam and its economic history but is also attested by the fact that European colonialism could not truly dominate Muslim lands during the 19th century without first dismantling the economic structures, and these structures depended on Sharia regulations, laws, and values to a significant extent. This is one important reason why the colonialist project insisted on rooting out the Sharia, it having been an impediment to Europe's political expansion and, far more importantly, economic domination. This perceived and actual impediment sums it all up, for it speaks to the Sharia's incompatibility, as a moral system, with the ways and values of modern capitalism. Essential to any account of the Sharia's moral economy is the idea that the protection and promotion of property and wealth represents one of the five universals. Kuliyat. According to which the Sharia legal system, and therefore Islamic society as a whole, had been structured and was made to operate. Protection of life, religion, mind, and community were the other four. Accomplished through the laws of homicide and of grievous bodily injury, the universal of protecting life. Nafs. Includes, but is not limited to, criminal compensatory damages and, in the case of homicide, the agnate's right. But not the state's. To seek monetary damages, choose capital punishment, or grant pardon. Protection of religion. Din. Is promoted by what we call technologies of the self as well as through the laws of jihad and ridda. Apostasy. Amounting, respectively, to defending the rights of Muslims against outside threat and internal religious dissension. Protection of mind or rational faculty. Aql. Quintessential to any legal act, including prayer, pilgrimage, etc. Is brought about through various regulations that determine legal capacity and the necessity of interdiction as well as such laws that prohibit the consumption of inebriants. Preservation of the community. NASL. Is achieved by the laws regulating marriage, illicit sexual relationships, divorce, inheritance, custody, and the like. Although the term NASL literally means children or lineage, the legal meaning and laws pertaining to this category effectively covered the extended family and, by implication, the community in which it lived and with which every extended family established marriage and other socio-economic ties. The five universals, consensually accepted in Islam as defining the purposes of the moral law, and instituted for serving the best interests of the believers, emerged in jurisprudence as the result of an inductive project whereby, after the Sharia had reached a level of maturity, the jurists looked back at the whole picture, so to speak, and culled these universals from the full range of legal culture, not limiting themselves to the texts of revelation or the rational methods of legal theory. Ul al-Fiqh. In other words, the overall effect of the Sharia as a discursive, theoretical, institutional, and practical system was boiled down to these universals, which, in turn, once unpacked and elaborated to the finest detail, produced nothing but the Sharia, in all that it was. Drawing on at least 5 centuries of established legal tradition, the universals were inductively identified and later continually elaborated, having become paradigmatic features defining the Sharia as a legal and cultural system. Indeed, they may be said to capture much of what Islam was all about. None of these 5 universals is autonomous, however. To be implemented to any reasonable measure and to be meaningful, each universal is bound to draw upon and overlap with the others, maintaining with them a relationship of interdependence. The universal of protecting life is obviously an essential one and provides the basic structure of order without which none of the other 4 universals can be pursued. The universal of protecting religion is equally foundational, because it determines both the quality and texture of the order that the first principle, that of life, had established. Jihad and apostasy do not denote the simplistic and crude political meanings they have come to acquire nowadays but represent deep conceptual structures that tie in with religious works. A mildly ascetic philosophy of life, and the all-important technologies of the self. If the first universal is a mechanical apparatus that lays the foundations of social order, the universal of religion gives this order its values, meanings, psychology, and spirituality. By this logic, it follows that the universal pertaining to the family and community intermeshes with the universal of religion, because the latter is also the foundation, and productive, of the former. Yet all of these, including the universal of the mind, constitute the matrix within which the universal of property is made both possible and constructive. It is also this universal of property that engages in a dialectic with any of the other three to promote the remaining fifth. To say that elements belonging to the entire set of universals were put in motion simultaneously whenever one of them was invoked for action is to sum up the matter accurately. Thus, the principle of property was delimited, constrained, supported, and brought out into reality by a structural dialectic of Shari values, practices, and institutions. The very principles of property rights and the acquisition, maintenance, and dispensation of wealth were all at once regulated by a dialectic of spiritual, metaphysical, and worldly considerations. Seeking material wealth and accumulation of capital was encouraged in Islam and its Sharia. The Prophet himself was a business manager and a trader, having married a powerful woman who was a considerable merchant in her own right. The Quran likewise declares trade and business to be legitimate activities to be pursued once the religious duty to pray is discharged. The Sharia has also come to possess elaborate rules and regulations for sale, contract, and trade. The overall space devoted to such issues, including business partnerships, pledge, transfer, agency, deposit, loans, insolvency, civil misappropriation, leases, rent, hire, and the like constitutes no less than 15% of the vast written record of the Sharia. When other financial regulations and laws pertaining to taxation, inheritance, bequests, gifts, charitable foundations, divorce, and the like are included, the percentage rises to about, if not in excess of, 1/4 of that totality. Considering the paramount importance of the pillars that constituted the technologies of the self and in view of the sacred place that family and laws relative to the family have come to acquire, not to mention the other nearly countless areas of regulation, allotting 1/4 of textual attention to contract, trade, and financial transactions is quite remarkable. All contractual transactions under the Sharia are imbued with moral values. To be valid, contracts must presuppose, inter alia, raya, a morally and psychologically charged concept. Raya is a wholehearted consent devoid of any trace of coercion or even reluctance. It presupposes fair dealing, good faith, and psychological ease by all contracting parties. Commerce and trade, being contractual, must be situated in this framework, one that requires forgiveness, magnanimity, samah, rectitude, and avoidance of greed, avarice, and placing oppressive constraints on one's contractual partners. God will have mercy upon a man who is magnanimous in his selling, buying and settling debts, lawsuits, etc. The honest and truthful merchant accompanies the prophets to paradise, whereas those merchants who cheat and swindle will face the fire of hell for their sins. Trade is suspicious if conducted within a market in which property and money have been corrupted by malpractices, whether these involve misappropriation, risk, or riba. Charging usury. The fear that trade, and the money made from it, have been, even unknowingly, corrupted by the market's immoral practices prompted the Sharia to install legal and moral mechanisms that were intended to purify that money. Hence the demand to pay the alms tax, zakat, and to engage in various other charitable practices, including adaka and, indirectly, waqf. This latter having commanded nearly half of all real property in Muslim lands by the 16th century. It was the presumption that in every sale there is the potential presence of anathema, a moral liability, this because one does not always know, however honest one may be, where his profit came from. This liability is so grave that it is said to raise the fury of God's anger. Gab al-Rab. And the surest way to appease this anger is to engage in charity for the benefit of the poor and even the wayfarers. Those who hoard wealth, who make money for the sake of making money, who, in other words, forego social responsibility as a genuine act of worship, have one certain fate: burning in hell. This moral impulse is neither incidental nor does it hover at the margins of the legal culture. It is paradigmatic, surrounding and thoroughly permeating the fabric of the Sharia's rules about property, contracts, investments, commercial transactions, and anything having to do with profit. None of these emanates from a brute or inert world. Rather, they are integral to the bounties that God has bestowed on humankind. He has given this kind all these blessings and comforts without expecting a share in them for himself. Because his profit, the return on his investment in potentially ungrateful humans, is obtaining their gratefulness to him. Yet, the teleology of the gratefulness to him who is self-sufficient, Ghani, does not finally rest with him, since gratefulness has an anthropological reflexivity and can be expressed only in one way. Giving to the poor, fellow human beings, as a way of appreciating the basic fact that one is alive and enjoys secure sustenance above and beyond one's basic needs. Gratefulness, in Sharia's definition, thus translates, even at this modest level of securing sustenance, into a fully fledged conception of social responsibility. Earning a living to the extent that one needs to support oneself and one's family and to pay one's debts is a religious obligation and an incumbent duty. The Sharia's fundamental position is one that adopts the principle of istifaf, namely, seeking whenever possible economic independence and avoiding financial help from others. However, earnings beyond this basic level of sustenance are recommended. Mustab. Even though only for the purpose of spending them on the poor or assisting distant relatives in need. It is also permissible. Mubah. To engage in business ventures that may yield large fortunes, which may be expended in the enhancement of a better style of life and even opulent living. But this permissibility is predicated upon the condition that one's life is conducted according to the virtues of religion, where honesty, modesty, rectitude, good faith, and fair dealings are given first priority and supreme value. Here two sets of obligations must be fulfilled: the rights of God and the rights of one's fellow human beings. Any earnings beyond those necessary for sustenance must be expended. For the first set of rights, they must be spent as alms tax, zakat, as various other stipulated and unstipulated charities, adaqat, waqf, etc., and as tax on land income. For the second set, any surplus must be used to settle personal debts, fulfill pecuniary agreements, and support the extended family, including distant relatives in need. Nafaqat. It should be noted, furthermore, that because all wealth is always assumed to belong to God, the poor are seen to have a natural right to a part of the wealth of the rich, this wealth being defined as income that exceeds the needs for self-sufficiency. The Quran explicitly decrees this right. Lawful earnings, kasib, must fulfill all these conditions, but three others are noteworthy in our context. First, any income or profit made must be conceived, at a psychological level, as coming from God and His grace, this being an integral part of the technologies of the self we have discussed earlier. Second, no excessive effort should be expended in acquiring wealth, this standing in sharp contrast to the principle that utmost effort, jihad, must be exerted in the struggle to be a better moral subject. Thus, whereas moral striving requires total effort, material gain is assigned a lower priority. Finally, in the process of making a living or acquiring wealth, no creature of God may be harmed. Acquisition of wealth, permitted and even encouraged, is therefore regulated by and subordinated to higher moral principles that place qualitative constraints on it. These principles are not of the technical legal type but harken back to the epistemic and psychological technologies of the moral subject. It is simply not enough to avoid engaging in obvious usurious and risk-ridden gharar business ventures, two pillars on which modern Islamic banking and finance claim to rest, and even then problematically. Conducting business and making profit must be sustained by a holistic view of the world. A view that derives from a system of practices and beliefs constituting and reflecting the entire range of the technologies of the self, which shape and sustain the moral subject. These technologies are utterly absent from any account of modern Islamic banking and finance, a phenomenon that when coupled with the narrow technical concerns that pervade these accounts, compels the conclusion that both the theory and practice of current Islamic banking and finance are deeply flawed. At the end of the day, they are Islamic merely in name, reflecting nearly nothing of what Islam as a moral system is all about. 3. Concluding remarks about predicaments. Having supposed the coming into existence of Islamic governance, we are forced also to suppose that this governance will be subject to the challenges posed by a globalized world. We have identified at least 3 such challenges: the militarism of powerful imperial states, exogenous cultural intrusions, and a massive liberal capitalist world market. These challenges are not independent of one another, however, because the centers of military power are nearly identical to the sources that emit cultural and economic hegemony. At times the economic challenge is accompanied by both military and cultural impositions. And cultural domination has also often proven to support economic globalization and its free markets. Our history since the Cold War, from Vietnam and Angola to the occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq, has offered clear proof of the operation of the 3 forces, acting both severally and aggregately. While military power and wars have, on their own and without the involvement of cultural and economic hegemony, been integral to human history for millennia, they are now often inseparable from this hegemony. Military defeat in the fashion of Afghanistan and Iraq is, if not imminent, always a possibility facing any form of Islamic governance. As long as the balance of power in the world remains in favor of a Schmittian state, Islamic governance as an existential entity will always be under fatal threat. Culture is a less tangible and more insidious form of control. An Islamic governance, having reached the consciousness and sophistication that are prerequisites for such self-constitution, will be forced to peruse and evaluate globalized cultural forms. Whether they are performing or visual arts, culinary or dietary habits, commercially manipulated sexual images or sexualizing the body, subliminal or manipulative advertisement, etc. Islamic governance must take a stance with regard to all these issues. It will. We must also assume, understand the sources of such cultural phenomena. Its materialism, hedonism, and narcissism, and its structural tendency to separate morality and value, on the one hand, from fact, science, law, and economics, on the other. It will understand what makes for the disenchantment of the modern subject and the national narcissism imbuing the modern mind. Every painting, sculpture, and culinary experience must be re-evaluated according to different norms and values, asking questions about aesthetics as much as about the human mind and body and their purposes in this world. Whatever is deemed unfit for the cultural landscape of Islamic governance must be discarded, and this is where the challenge lies. How will this governance rebuff the forces of globalized culture, forces fully backed by the superior, positivism-grounded powers in the world? How will it stem the intrusiveness of the giant corporations who are backed by these powers and who push their products into the hands, bodies, and minds of teenagers and adults alike? The severity of these challenges is surely undeniable. Certainly no less crucial is the economic challenge. If Islamic governance is to pursue its economic goals, which promote trade, financial investment, and profit-making, it must contend with a global market that is backed by powerful liberal and staunchly capitalist states, a market dominated by the corporation and its endless and amoral pursuit of profit. The question as to why Islam never developed a corporate juristic personality has been debated since the 1960s, but an answer that rests on moral analysis has, interestingly, not been forthcoming. The Sharia's lack of recognition of this personality has been seen as a deficiency, one of the many of which Sharia is accused. It has not occurred to the critics advancing such superficial explanations that it is precisely the moral bent of the Sharia that has precluded this possibility. Sharia's morality may well have recognized that certain things simply cannot be done. Not because they intrinsically and objectively cannot be done, but because once done, the consequences cannot be tolerated. This perhaps being one of the finest definitions of morality. This intolerance for sacrificing value is precisely the moment of moral sanity that propelled the English government to ban the corporation momentarily during the 16th century. But that sanity was not long-lived. With its 12 centuries of continuous and extensive experience, the Sharia could not accept the concept of a corporation because it ran in diametrical opposition to its moral principles. The moral and legal accountability of natural persons may be said to have been the deepest running anchor of the Sharia, perhaps the feature that gave the Sharia its character. The corporation and all that it represents as a virulent capitalist enterprise is not only amoral and often immoral. It is also the epitome of anti-Shariaism. Even if Islamic governance were to mitigate and tone down its moral imperatives, traces of this morality would still be highly incompatible with modern capitalism and its principal weapon, the corporation. Furthermore, economists have for long understood that any modern national economy will inevitably experience serious difficulties in maintaining economic growth if at the same time it tried to implement a policy guaranteeing a decent measure of social and economic justice. They have declared that economic structures and policies that promote growth depress distributional equality. Paradigmatic Islamic governance is by definition geared toward implementing such guarantees, for social justice is one of its constitutive and central features. Within a globalized capitalism, such governance would progressively weaken, becoming less and less competitive, resulting in economic and a host of other social and political problems. It is likely to grow dependent on foreign help, thereby losing its autonomy in favor of IMF or World Bank governance. No doubt, these latter would impose on this type of governance, as they nowadays routinely do, their rules of reorganization and thus frustrate any attempt to build this governance into a meaningful and autonomous entity.